Good evening. Today is Monday, February 20th, 2023, and this is the 138th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. Before we begin our podcast today, again, I do want to take this opportunity to pass on our collective prayers to the people that are suffering the after effects of the powerful 7.8 magnitude quakes, which was followed by a 7.5 magnitude quake 9 hours later, hitting southern Turkey and also parts of Syria almost 3 weeks ago. Unfortunately, again today, another 6.4 magnitude quake hit both countries, now possibly killing more than 50,000 plus people and burying almost 150,000. Unfortunately, as it has added to the destruction of the region, the people in the region are now again fighting for survival in the wake of the newest and strongest earthquakes that have hit that area in almost a century. We ask everybody out there in our viewing audience, please keep those people in your prayers. As also we celebrate today, President's Day, let's not forget our own brethren here, our American brethren in the East Palestine, who are now dealing with the ongoing ecological disaster that is unfolding in Ohio, as residents are still trying to search for answers as to what happened and still begging the federal government for needed support nearly almost 2 weeks now after a train carrying toxic chemicals derailed on the borders of Ohio and also Pennsylvania. I do ask our federal government out there to support and respond to our citizens as quickly as possible, especially on this President's Day. Before we begin our coverage and our discussion today with my guest, a message from our sponsor, Epoch Times.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
My guest today is my dear friend and also a colleague at the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement, Al Johnson. Al is a senior advisory board member, and he is serving as a director of research for Southeast Asia and also Japan for NEC-SE. Al is here today to discuss with us who is really pushing Turkey out of NATO and why, and also if this happens, to analyze the real possibility that Turkey may decide to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, that is led by China and the Chinese Communist Party. Al, it's good to have you here. Before we begin, I do want to, again, touch upon what happened with the earthquake. We have a short video for our audiences. I'm going to get your perspective on it, and then we're going to begin discussing what really Turkey is dealing with, which is more than just an earthquake, possibility of being lost to NATO.
A magnitude 6.4 earthquake has struck the Turkey-Syria border region near the town of Defne. The earthquake struck at around 8 o'clock p.m. local time, which wasn't so long ago, causing the walls of already damaged buildings to crumble. In fact, it was probably the last hour or two. The quake was strongly felt in Antakya, some 200 kilometres away. According to Turkey's Disaster and Emergency Management Authority, more than 6,000 aftershocks have been recorded since that 7.8 magnitude quake struck the region 2 weeks ago, and the pair of quakes 2 weeks ago.
Welcome to the show. It's unfortunate that this has happened, but I wanted to get your thoughts first, and then we can start looking at what Turkey's dealing with besides just disasters, everything that has to do as far as facing the pressures that NATO is putting on it. And it's unfortunate that even today you had the Secretary of State on the ground, and you had Swedish representatives really squeezing Turkey even now, as they're dealing with this crisis on the ground, trying to ensure that Sweden gets approval to be a member of NATO.
Yeah, it's particularly tough for Turkey, because if you look at kind of the trend line, over the last few months, economically, they've been, trying to gain control like many other nations in Syria, Pakistan, as you mentioned the other day in the phone conference, regarding their currency. And so, they've already got this need to try to balance out their currency and put some money into infrastructure and development. And suddenly they get hit with, a tremendous disaster, which was, the earthquakes. And it kind of, laid bare some of the shortcuts in construction that were done, over time in some of those areas in Turkey. But it's a huge humanitarian disaster. And then today, for that second earthquake to hit, that's going to hit their confidence even further. And then, on top of that, rightly or wrongly, the Turkish public, from what we saw on the OSET side, didn't see the perception that the West was really helping out a lot, especially the U.S. They highlighted, for example, an Iranian rescue mission that came forward with search and rescue teams and some aid teams that went forward, and then they parked that plane right by the Israeli team that came in on the tarmac. So you had Israeli and Iran right next to each other on the tarmac, and that was capturing kind of their news cycle, what was able to get out in their news cycle. But a lot of commentators, from the translations of some of the OSET stuff, basically were noting that hey, where's the U.S. help in that? In fact, they're just pressuring. They're continuing down Ukrainian, help with Ukraine, but nothing here for your ally that's been here forever, that's actually part of NATO. And so that was a big issue. And then, like you said, on the heels of, the rejection or the severe reservations about the Nordic countries coming into NATO and the expansion of NATO, and Turkey's having some severe thoughts about that. And basically, a lot of the Turkish people and some of their politicians are asking, hey, with friends like these. So it's very difficult for them in difficult times. When they look around and they see their long-term NATO ally not exactly, standing up for them, or at least being perceived as not giving help, much like the people in East Palestine right now, ironically.
Yeah, obviously. Look, and I do want to let our viewing audience know, I do know that, for those that are out there, Near East, as the CEO, I am not putting our poor board members inside of utility closets. Al is actually out there today for a mission in a remote area, which is a surveillance mission. So this is the only place we had to be able to connect with him. So this is not the Near East Center that he's coming to us from. This is our remote location that he's operating in today. Al, what I would want to do is, as you mentioned, where the president's priorities are on this President's Day, and there's his trip that took place today into Ukraine, a war zone. I do want to show what was the results of that and how it's being covered by the Russian media, and then come back and further have a discussion on to where are we trying to put our effects under the current administration.
Russia's flagship talk show 60 Minutes discussing Joe Biden's trip to Kyiv. The host, Olga Skabeva, asks if Russia had guaranteed his safety, and if so, why. We could have killed Biden, but that would have been too much, her guest replies. We spoke to Sergei Markov, a one-time advisor to President Putin, just after he came off the show.
Washington made contacts with Russia before the visit to avoid nuclear war. It was about not killing President of the United States, Joe Biden, from Russian rocket missiles.
Because this would have meant potential nuclear war if anything had happened to him.
Yes, one of the possibility of the killing President of the United States or President of Russia, that it can lead to the nuclear war.
No comment yet from the Kremlin, but this is a week packed with presidential speeches. There is plenty of time. And these pictures will be spun to further the Kremlin's narrative that Ukraine does Joe Biden's bidding and that the real enemy here is the United States. No doubt the symbolism of this trip is not lost on Vladimir Putin, but unlike this time a year ago, he understands now there is no quick win to this war. He's seen the shape of Ukrainian bravery and of its allies' resolve in money and tanks and sanctions. And it hasn't stopped him yet. China's top diplomat was in Hungary today ahead of a trip to Moscow. The Kremlin says he may meet the president after the US warned China against supplying military aid to support Putin's war effort. China has not so far. But if it does, this terrible war in Europe could become more dangerous still. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Moscow.
Al, the symbolism, as they say, wasn't lost on everybody. But I will tell you, on President's Day, there was a lot of pushback, even, and I can understand, because you had fellow Americans here in the East Palestine saying that today he should have been here on the ground with us instead of being in Ukraine. And as the POTUS did deliver a strong message almost a year into the war now, that we are going to support Ukraine and offered monetary support. Again, it was an issue that Americans here in East Palestine were not happy about, because funding and support from the federal government, especially on this President's Day, still hasn't made it there. But with that said, you kind of see the complicated type of a relationship that exists between NATO partners, to include Turkey, and what is happening there, given the fact that, as we were talking about the earthquake relief, U.S. aid still really hasn't executed major contracts in Turkey for support. A lot of it's coming out of those humanitarian organizations are on the ground. But USAID has talked about possibly supporting some monetary packages for some of the contractors that it believes would be capable to purchasing stuff on the ground internally, which has really put Turkey in a position that it doesn't understand. Should I be on the U.S. side from the NATO perspective, or should I try to hedge my bets with the Russians, in this case, allowing them, as they are now, for wheat and other foods to be able to move through their ports. Your perspective on everything that I just talked about, especially the president's trip to Ukraine.
Well, the optics are everything right now. So, we're going from kind of this, kind of a world order that has been, kind of the remnants of kind of the Cold War stabilized, where the U.S. was kind of a unipower. But over time, it's beginning to, degrade. And in that degrade, as you know, every time there's a vacuum of power, there's going to be groups that will try to, get those power vacuums filled with their own interests. And you'll see nations beginning to act more in their own interests now than ever before. Whereas before you had kind of broad coalitions. Now you're getting, more regional coalitions. And sometimes the subjects aren't really what the United States is focused on. As far as optics of what Biden's trip was, that's debatable, because he hasn't visited, Ohio. So here was the Chernobyl right here in the backyard of America, and he didn't visit it. The EPA was very slow. They didn't declare it, a disaster area, even though I think the governor asked for it. If he had visited it, if he had reacted very quickly after that environmental disaster, then I don't think there would have been as much pushback or blowback if he went to Ukraine, on the President's Day. The fact is, he never went there. I mean, this thing's been going on since February the 4th, I believe, February 3rd, 4th. And he hasn't responded in anything. Buttigieg hasn't really done a lot out there. There's not a lot of federal focus to be able to help this. And then at the same time, during this time when people are asking for money for FEMA help, for a lot of federal aid, most of that tends to go overseas. And again, the optics of what's going on. So you can imagine that the outrage of people in Ohio when they see this, hey, we're asking for help. There's nothing here. And you're sending it to a war that, Americans emotionally understand, but over time, it actually drags on. They don't intellectually understand it. And they're kind of like, okay, the emotion wears off. So why are we there? Prove to me why we're there. Why are we spending $1 million to Ukraine and not to Ohio? You have to argue, because those emotions ran out about 8 months ago, right? That's about as long as you can kind of sustain folks, in the home front and combat without continued, something else to kind of charge them up. So you imagine the outrage of the people in Ohio. Now imagine the people in Turkey. And over time, there have been other events that has kind of begun to create fractures between the Turkish relationship with the senior NATO partner, which is the United States. One of which was back in 2016, I think 15 July 2016. They had a coup attempt against Erdogan, and a lot of Turks, and a lot of depending on who you read, even Erdogan thinks that was a U.S.-led, almost a U.S.-led coup, or at least a U.S. quietly supported coup. Because we didn't come out and condemn it right away, and we didn't support Erdogan after he had actually, stopped the coup. And so that was kind of a fracture in the relationship between the United States and Turkey. So that began, kind of widening the gap between us. So when you now have this huge disaster in Turkey, and the U.S. planes aren't flying flags coming in there and being very, very visible, with the eye candy moment that, hey, we're here to support you with a very strong message. That in itself sends a message, right? So in other words, if you're quiet about what you're doing, that sends a powerful message as well. Or your intent could be misinterpreted as you weren't here, you weren't helping. The best one I remember is on that is Bill Lokey in FEMA in New Orleans. We were talking to the deputy director of FEMA during the Hurricane Katrina response. And he noticed that, he said, hey, FEMA was here, we're doing stuff, but because CNN wasn't filming FEMA tags on everything they were bringing in, they were coordinating everything coming in, people didn't think FEMA was in his zone that he was working on. And he says, you have to be overt with your messaging about, yes, I'm here to support you. Nations can't be, quietly generous. They have to be overt about it, because most of the capital you get is in your dollars and your support, but it's also in the goodwill and feelings that go on. And the U.S. used to understand that. We used to be kind of forefront humanitarian aid all over the world. And I don't recognize it anymore, because we're sending billions of dollars not to reconstruction efforts or to help anyone as far as we can see. And it's not being reflected in any OSINT. And it's definitely not being seen by people overseas who really need to see it in order for us to keep these alliances, good feelings, and, kind of that diplomatic relationship that we need to avoid future conflicts or losing your friends. And that's kind of where we're going with this one is Turkey is beginning to, over time, they've begun to shift to the SCO axis. They had before 1997, so 1995, 97, before that, if you look at the Turkish history, they were, not antagonistic to China, but they weren't really friendly to China. In fact, they even had there was a Uyghur, Isa Yusuf Alpertken, who was a Uyghur leader. And he was in Turkey, and he was, raising awareness about the plight of the Uyghurs way back in 95, before 95. He was pushing that in Turkey, and Turkey supported him. And so a lot of the civilian side in Turkey, has kind of residual negative feelings toward China because of their policy toward the ethnic Turk Uyghurs, right? So that's, their fellow Islam, and they see them as Turks, right? It's kind of this pan-Turkic movement. And they will identify a lot of the Uyghurs as Turks, as fellow brothers, so to speak, and they saw China as hitting it. But the government with Erdogan began to change in about 95 to 97, and he began to what they call face east. So he began to face east and have more of a friendly relationship with China, and that grew over time. So much so that in 2010, there was a Turkic-Sino agreement, strategic partnership agreement. In 2015, Turkey actually joined the Belt and Road Initiative to link it up with what it sees as its middle passage. So it has kind of a middle trade route that Turkey's looking at. And they want to link up their trade lines and expand into Asia and tap the Chinese market with their own trade lines. And just a few years ago, they actually opened up the freight line. So there's a rail freight that goes from Istanbul to Xi'an in China, and it delivers cargo and goods. In about 2 weeks, you can move freight, large amounts of freight over the rails between Istanbul and Xi'an, China. And so those are, that's a solid link in the Belt and Road Initiative that they're going to be able to do and work on that. And so that increases these economic ties between China. China's already promised infrastructure development, on top of what Erdogan's already invested. So these links are already there, and it's already growing at the same time that we're kind of, intentionally or not, we're insulting Turkey, or we're not paying it enough attention. And so then it creates the potential that, not just are they perhaps going to walk out of a meeting, but they may walk out of NATO. I mean, if you can't beaten up your friend long enough, they say, well, what's the benefit of being in the alliance? I'm not really seeing it anymore. And that's kind of disturbing to a lot of degree. And Turkey will go its own way. If everybody remembers the initial push in Operation Iraqi Freedom, right? So when we were going in, the initial plan was to have those armor divisions up in Turkey come down to Baghdad from the north. And Turkey went, nah, we're not going to support that. They were delaying, dragging their feet. And that set a lot of timetables back. So Turkey will, play hardball if they want to, because they still have a kind of a neo-Ottoman belief that, they have their rightful place in the sun in, the Middle East. So they still have, large political groups over there that still want to reclaim that place in the sun. And they see a larger coalition led by Turkey. And they may begin to see the SCO as the mechanism to do that, because they'll gain position, they'll gain economics, they'll gain things that the U.S. isn't giving them, and they won't get beat up every time they question, why are we letting these countries into NATO? So we have to be very cautious about how we treat our allies, because it may be that we move them, push them into the other column, even if they're neutral. it creates a problem if they're no longer in NATO. So the Soviet Union, that was a key part in the Cold War, as you know, basing Air Force assets and missiles in Turkey to have that southern flank going up into Russia and control the Dardanelles, the exit of the Black Sea. If that goes into the neutral column or supportive of Russia, then you don't have that choke point, as you were mentioning earlier today.
Well, look, as you mentioned, I think, you have to, in a good time, you stand with your friends, and in bad times. But in this case, especially today, when you have another earthquake hitting, at the same time, you have more people dying in Turkey. You have Secretary of State Blinken on the ground, and not to say that you cannot multitask, but squeezing Turkey into allowing Sweden to be part of the NATO membership. Sometimes it's just not the right time to be able to approach somebody. Wait a day or two before you may be discussing other issues. But I think that the administration currently is being squeezed itself because of the fact that Russia, we knew, had almost 4 divisions ready to conduct another possible attack into the Ukraine areas. And also at the same time, Ukraine is preparing for its own counterattack into the areas that it wants to take to be able to finally, hopefully, culminate this next possible Russian assault that is coming in. And as far as China is concerned, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I do know that Iran is a signatory now, based on the last visit that when the Supreme Leader of Iran had made here during the UN discussion, he did sign a final permanent signatorial pact with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But China has never looked at extending the Belt and Road Initiative through Iran. It always tried to get into the Southern Caucasus, the old northern Silk Road, which is the reason why it poured so much support and money into Azerbaijan at the same time, which is Azerbaijan is very close to Turkey based on the ethnic relations that they have had, and at the same time, economic relations that they've had historically, and tried at the same time prior to the war with Russia and Ukraine war, really pressure Ukraine president at that time, Zelensky, to allow China to move into Ukraine and use that as a means to be able to get into the EU, which Zelensky stated it just the day prior to the letter coming out from Putin, warning him that war will happen if he does not basically change his path when it comes to how he's trying to break those deals with China, and specifically being the basically the doormat to the EU. But I do want to kind of show a video that takes everything that we've talked about and give us an update as to where we are and why Turkey is in the position that it may be right now, and then come back and discuss what happened today on the ground with the State Department.
After far-right activists burnt a copy of the Quran under police protection in front of the Turkish embassy in Stockholm on Saturday, President Erdogan reacted on Monday, saying that's it for Turkey ratifying Swedish membership to NATO.
Do not expect such support from us. The fact that this despicable attack on the Holy Quran took place in front of the Turkish embassy makes the issue both a national and religious matter for us.
The act has triggered protests in Jordan, Yemen and Iraq. Erdogan immediately said no when Sweden applied to join NATO last May, and attempts at salvaging relations just enough now seem dead in the water, as Ankara cancels the Swedish defence minister's visit and uninvites the Speaker of the House. The Swedish PM's response to the act was limited to a tweet, defending freedom of speech, but conceding that what is legal is not necessarily appropriate, calling the act deeply respectful and expressing sympathy with those it offended. Turkey's main objection to Sweden's accession to NATO up until now is perceived Swedish sympathy with the Kurdish Workers' Party, classed as a terrorist organisation by Turkey, the EU and the US. Sweden has taken steps to assuage these concerns, including by signing a memorandum calling the group a terrorist organisation. But protests flying the PKK flag have continued to the ire of Ankara, and effigies of President Erdogan are a recurring trope.
Today, Al, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, as I said, called for Sweden and also Finland to be accepted into NATO as quickly as possible, even with everything that we just saw. His Turkish counterpart, of course, diminished the possibility of any link also between their accession and also Turkey's request for the F-16 jet fighters that they have requested. And as you know, Turkey has delayed the Nordic countries, as you mentioned earlier, admission to the Transatlantic Defense Alliance, given the concerns, as was mentioned in the video, of the terrorism. And some of the members of the U.S. Congress now have also approved the F-16 deal to Ankara, tied to its position to be able to enlarge NATO, which may not happen. So I'm not sure where Blinken is still pushing for this particular requirement, maybe not understanding that you may lose Turkey, or maybe we do understand that Turkey may decide that we're going to go the other route if we push them long enough. Maybe there's a reset, given the fact that, as it was mentioned by the vice president just a few days ago, before the in a response to which the North Koreans decided to launch ballistic missiles against Japan, that this is a global war. Your perspective?
Well, I think the Quran burning in some means was useful to Erdogan. And the reason I say that is because if he'd have been principled about it, he would be against China, right? But he wasn't. He's since '97, like I said, has improved relations with China. And China burns Uyghurs. They don't burn Quran. They burn Muslims, right? In other words, they're wiping out entire, they're conducting a genocide in Xinjiang there. So, I think there's a lot of other issues probably behind the scenes that were talked about. And so that was kind of his, hey, this is a focal point that I can now use this to, say this is really why I'm not being able to go in there. But the fact that we didn't go, that we're pressuring Turkey in normal politics and normal political times. Okay, sometimes you got to play hardball, and you have to understand your adversary, right? So in anything from interrogations to negotiations, right? You have to assess the person sitting across from you, and you have to be able to deal with them, right? What's the outcome I want? Understand what his outcome, what he wants, and then work a deal between that and negotiate during those conversations. That doesn't seem to be what we're doing now that much. In fact, we seem to be kind of like a bull in a china shop as far as foreign diplomacy is concerned, because we continually alienate and abandon allies. I mean, look what happened with the sudden withdrawal in Afghanistan. I mean, it's more about what the messaging of that was and the mechanism that we did it, not so much that we got out, but the way in which we just, turned off the lights, ran out the door, and, flew the planes out of there with people hanging on it. That sent a heck of a message to our allies. In other words, when will the U.S. be on our side or not? I mean, even such allies as as Japan are beginning to have second thoughts. Will the U.S. stand by us? And so that's a disturbing trend to have, because we should be coming from it. We're coming from it supposedly from a position of strength. We have this very long alliance with Turkey. They've been a NATO ally for a very long time. We have a long history with Turkey, and for us to treat an ally this way, especially in their hour of need, right? So put it on the back burner. Still keep the heat on, but put it on the back burner. And in the face of diplomacy, as should be okay. We're going to fly in lots of planes with American flags and aid, and we're going to help you guys out as much as possible. And in public, hey, don't worry about this. I'm not going to embarrass you as the leader. And that puts Erdogan in a tough spot, right? Because in other words, hey, here's the Americans helping our people out, and they're just asking for the small favor in the back, right? And as in that region, that's important, right? You were very hospitable to us, helped us out in our time of need, and then you're asking just a little bit in return. That would have been much better, right? Do this incremental, kind of piecemeal up, and the optics would have been better, and it would have showed the U.S. as a strong ally for our old allies, a good friend for our old allies and support. And when we do the opposite of that, when we don't show our face, when we're not overt about, hey, we're sending aid to Turkey, we're helping you guys out. Instead, we kind of double down on demands when they're already unstable. You have to wonder, where is the U.S. position? And like you said, it may be that there are certain groups or certain, cliques or a school of thought that wants to move it out of the friend column into the neutral or the enemy column. And is there a historical precedent for that? Yeah. So, in the study of real politics, so to speak, in history, there are a couple of instances where that occurred. Number one was, actually the British and how they handled the Russians in World War I. So actually before World War I. So Britain had its eye set on Germany, right? This is kind of a long thing, but it'll explain it. So Britain had its eye set on Germany. They knew as late as 1890, we're going to wipe out, Germany's got to go. They can't be an economic peer competitor for us. They just didn't want to do it. And then 1905, they started looking at Mackinder and thinking, well, if Germany expands and they get Russia on their side, that would rule the world. Britain won't rule the world, because that was the Mackinder theory. Whoever has that kind of that reach in that Central European area going to Eastern Europe, they rule the world, and Britain wasn't going to have that. But Russia was not going to go on Britain's side, because it's like, well, hey, the Kaiser's my cousin. So Nikolai was like, nah, the Kaiser's my cousin. I'm not going to do it. So what did Britain do? For the first time in British history, they did a foreign treaty. Now, who did they do it with? They did it with Japan. Yeah, everybody's like, wait a minute, here's this, Japan was just a small country, way in the middle of Asia at the point. They had beaten China, but everybody was beaten up on China, in the 19th century. So they make a deal with Japan. They make a treaty with Japan. They arm Japan with dreadnoughts. They gave Japan a couple of dreadnoughts that were bigger than the British dreadnoughts, and they financed them for the Russo-Japanese War. So, and they literally held their guns as Russia, sank a couple of British fishing boats on their way out of the Baltic Sea there to go around, all the way to fight in Tsushima over in Japan, right, the Sea of Japan. So the British, basically facilitated this war and funded it. I mean, they were over 60 to 70% loans to the Japanese. So they get over there. Of course, Togo, with all the big British dreadnoughts and everything else, wipes out the Russian fleet. It was more of a spectacular success than anybody thought. Russian fleet's at the bottom of the Tsushima Straits in the Sea of Japan, and Russia loses the war handily, right? So Japan, Teddy Roosevelt negotiates, was part of the team that negotiates a peace, Portsmouth Treaty. Now Russia's in a dire straits, and then there's all kind of agitation against the Tsar. There's little mini revolutions going on in Russia. It's very unstable against the Tsar, and he's broke. He just lost a war against the first Asian power in modern history, so he's not looking good. And what does Britain do? Even though they've got a treaty with Japan, they walk into Russia and go, "Hey, you guys need a navy, don't you?" And they paid for their navy. They gave them the navy. They helped them rebuild their ships. They helped them rebuild the navy. There is some evidence that they did finance some things to be able to kind of stabilize, Russia and help out with that. And so then the treaty with Russia, Britain was able to negotiate with Russia to get them to be the northern front, the northern hammer against Germany. And that was the plan, kind of in World War I, is the Russians come in the north, the French and the British Expeditionary Force move up into Belgium, and they'll meet in Berlin, right? That was the whole plan of that. And it'll be over by Christmas. That actually came from the Entente side. But what happened that nobody kind of expected was when Russia invaded Germany in a place called Tannenberg, they got beat. Two kind of reserve divisions and an old retired general they brought out of nowhere, Bismarck, beat the Russians all the way back to Warsaw. Nobody expected that. And then, as you know, Russia collapsed. And then that, the Northern Front kind of collapsed out, and World War I wasn't over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years. But that shows the level that people will go to and nations will go to. And it's just one example of many, and many nations, and every nation that can do it will do it. They actually had to beat up Russia. They fund Russia's collapse in a war against Japan in order to, make a deal later on and get in a better position for their geopolitical ends. The other one that's a little closer to home is the U.S. Would the U.S. do it? Yeah. In 1914, Australia attacked during World War I, the opening phases of World War I. Australia took over some of the German mandated islands, right? So they took over the Admiralty Islands, Papua New Guinea, went to the Australian column. So they basically were moving up in the islands and getting that. Japan joined the Entente side, the Ally side in World War I, and they grabbed the Micronesian islands, right? So names that became famous later on, Iwo Jima, Saipan, those kind of groupings of islands, they got those. The U.S. was livid. The U.S. was not in the war yet, but the Pacific was seen as our lake, right? That's our ocean. And so the U.S. was very upset over it. And there was actually talk within the U.S. in the Naval Department about taking over. In other words, we'll go to war. And then how do we go to war with Japan without, upsetting England and the Entente side? So they actually talked about it. But what came out of that was through the Orange War plan, planners said, wait a minute. If Japan has these islands, when we go to war with Japan, they've been working on War Plan Orange since Teddy Roosevelt told them in 1907, and it's now 1914. 7 years they've been working on this plan. They go, guess what? If Japan owns these islands, it's a lot easier for me to move my ships and island hop to go to Japan than if it's in a third country, or even if we own it. It's a little more difficult. So we're not violating anyone's neutrality. We're not having to go to war with a third party. Let them own it, because then we can gradually move into Japan by an island hopping campaign. And so 4 years later in the Treaty of Versailles, even though in 1914 we were livid that they took it over, the Japanese took over those islands, by 1918, we had no objections in the Treaty of Versailles about the final disposition of the islands going to Japan, as long as Japan didn't fortify. And that was our stipulation. But other than that, we were good with it because we were thinking ahead. So some of the planners that were involved in those plans, when you look at War Plan Orange and their contribution to from the Naval War College folks up into the War Plans Division and U.S. Navy, when they were looking at that and talking about it, that was their decision process. And so they're absolutely thinking about geostrategic positions. And so when you look at Turkey, Turkey is at a really good geopolitical, strategic position, especially for, European powers. It's one of the crossroads between, Asia and Europe and the Middle East. So it's in a fantastic position. The Dardanelles, remember we fought the Crimean War, or we didn't fight the Crimean War. France and Britain and, and Russia and the Ottoman Empire fought the Crimean War for the control of the Dardanelles. In World War I, Churchill almost lost everything because he was determined that Britain was going to grab the Dardanelles from the Ottoman Empire, who were allies with Imperial Germany at that time. I mean, these are strategic points that are vital for, especially in a European sense. So Turkey is absolutely important in a geostrategic position. Even, years ago with just ships. I mean, even now it's basics, right? So you've got positions where you can set up observation stations, electronic, monitoring stations, missile areas, Air Force aircraft stationings. I mean, it's vitally important, especially as China moves into the area. You need Turkey on your side as an ally, or at least you would think you would if you look at a map and you kind of look at the history of the relationship. But others may not see that, and they may want to maneuver it into a different position so that if a conflict comes about, they may see a different advantage by having Turkey in a different column than the allies. I don't know. So that's one of the questions that we need to ask and we need to look at.
No, I think it sometimes simplifies it. Look, as you were mentioning it just, what was it, a year ago, when Turkey closed off the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, as you said, to the warships of any of the countries that were, whether or not they were really bordering the Black Sea or not, following the Russia-Ukraine war beginning, which is going to be a year ago, this on the 24th. But that strait closure allowed also warships that were trying to return to their home bases in the Black Sea to return. And that would also mean the Russian ships that are outside of the country that are trying to come back into that ports, into the Black Sea. And this goes back to the Commission of 1936 that allows Turkey to do that. Now, it's possible that some people, because of the type of a relationship Turkey is now playing with on both sides, both with the Russians allowing grain to move through and also possibly trying to get the F-16 because I'm a member of NATO, maybe it would be easier for the allies in this case if it's pushed completely out of NATO, if they make any decisions economically in support of Russia and the Chinese Communist Party and the Belt and Road Initiative to use those straits, then guess what? It's game on, right? If you're no longer a member of Turkey or NATO, I should say, then I can use multi-force structures to no longer that particular treaty is going to be invoked anymore because now I can go ahead and use any type of multi-force structure to control those straits. So it might be that maybe that's what the maneuver is going to be. But in this case, Turkey being squeezed has to make that decision. Look, I mean, Turkey is facing elections that were supposed to take place in May. Possibly, if they get pushed to the right, who knows? Maybe the response that took place to this earthquake will push even the current President Erdogan out and may cause more instability internally in Turkey. You don't know who's going to be the next possible president, whether they're going to be closer to NATO, United States, or they might be closer to the Chinese and the Russians, in this case, the SCO. But I do want to go ahead and take a break here, Al, a message from our sponsor, and come back with a video to discuss why Turkey is in the position it is today.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read The Difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
Turkey might exit NATO in 6 months. Allies of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan have acknowledged a regression in talks on NATO expansion. The Justice and Development Party said the scandal around the burning of a copy of the Quran in front of the Turkish embassy in Stockholm made any sort of communication with Sweden meaningless. Meanwhile, there has been speculation since last year that Sweden and Finland may join NATO separately, and opposition media outlets in Ankara said Turkish officials had been deliberately sending mixed signals to their counterparts in the two Scandinavian countries. Deputy leader of the Patriotic Party, Ethem Sancak, said Turkey might withdraw from the North Atlantic Alliance in 5 to 6 months. He was echoed by Erdogan's ally in the parliamentary coalition, Turkey's Nationalist Movement Party leader, Devlet Bahçeli. Professor Togrul Ismail from Ankara University reminded that there have always been calls for Turkey to exit NATO, and US policy is one of the reasons why. Let's take a realistic look at the situation. Does Turkey have to leave NATO? Membership there means lower defense costs and improved military technology and gear. Moreover, it gives protection from both external enemies and forces within NATO, the expert argues. Staying in the alliance also means protection from attacks and makes it possible to maintain the country's independence, he added. Commenting on the potential outcome of the negotiations on accession to NATO, Ismail said everything would depend solely on Sweden. In his turn, Vladimir Frolov, who specializes in international relations, said that a synchronized accession to the bloc, something the US has been seeking for Sweden and Finland, is connected with the level of defense and activities in the Baltic. The expert proposed waiting for the results of the general elections in Turkey, which local officials say may be held this spring.
Al, the foreign minister of Turkey just today, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, stated in Ankara, countering what Blinken was saying, that what is going to happen within the region is really going to have those effects, whether or not Turkey's position is going to be in order to be able to support or will be willing to support Sweden. Now, I know that he stated that an approval for Finland will be supported joining NATO, but as far as Sweden is given, Turkey again went back to discussing the issues that you have separatist groups, Kurdish separatist groups from the Kurdish Workers' Party or the PKK that are still not just operating in Sweden, but are actively gaining support to wage what they've been continuing for the 39 years of insurgency against Ankara. So, look, keep in mind, the Armenian genocide happened almost 100 years ago, which the Ottoman Empire was responsible for the first genocide of the 20th century, where we also lost Assyrians and also Pontus Greeks. It took the United States just a few years ago to finally start squeezing Turkey in that aspect by pushing those non-binding resolutions that recognize the Armenian genocide. What did that lead into? It led to an invasion of Azerbaijan, basically, into Armenia, taking Armenian territories, being supported by Turkish drones within the region. And then we started squeezing Turkey based on their weapon systems approval, in this case, any aircrafts that they're looking for defense as a NATO partner. We're tying it to whether or not you're going to allow others to join NATO. Now, if you're going to start pushing them slowly, it seems like this process began almost a few years ago, and maybe it is a possible perspective that if they are finally in one sphere or the other, it is easier as this global war has expanded to be able to finally make clear decisions as to what you want to do. I just mentioned it last week in my interview that the European Union has come out and said that we are not going to support even Turkey in the reconstruction process of what it might be looking for after this earthquake. With the earthquake hitting, it has put Turkish elections in a complete turmoil. It really has squeezed Turkey economically, politically, and military-wise, which might be why we are where we are today, possibly pushing Turkey into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's arms. Maybe it's that simple. Maybe we just have to have a black and white when it becomes the possibility of a global war expanding where Turkey stands.
That's true. Yeah, it could be that way. So, it's kind of, which one came first, the chicken or the egg? Which one came first? Erdogan's look east or, U.S. pressure? And as we look over timelines, we can kind of see, arguments for, both ways on that. So, 2013, he said, hey, he brokered the ability of Turkey to go into, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So he said that 2013, also said 2016. 2015, he talked about, the Belt and Road Initiative going up with their east-west middle corridor, which is that, the Trans-Caspian, trade route that he's building. And then they linked up, recently their rail lines. So, I mean, if you look at those timelines, it's all before 2016. And then that's when, kind of that coup happened that he, different people or different groups in Turkey, say that the U.S. was behind, or at least, tactfully kind of supported. Which came first? Was it his facing east, and that, having an ally that's got one foot in the door with the enemy might be, not the best way to go. So, go ahead and just, hey, you're either with us or you're not. We need to get rid of this gray area here, because that's going to strategically and operationally be unsound because we don't know, like in Iraq, we made plans. We had ships on the containers. We had tanks on the containers that were en route, getting ready to go to offload in Turkey to go down into Baghdad.
Yep.
And then they said no, that's at timetables back and everything like that. So luckily the rest of the operation worked well, but it had a tremendous potential because your northern front is now gone. An entire directional front is gone because of an ally that went, okay, I changed my mind, right? So, that could be working within the calculus, and that's just not optically there. But I still think that there should be a little more optics for the people of Turkey to see, hey, in this time of need, just like people in Ohio, hey, the U.S. is here for you. We're not just bad guys that buy bullets. We'll buy Band-Aids and, baby cribs and things and whatever you need and build buildings back up. We need to get, I think, back into that. We've gone too far away from it. I don't know why. And if it's a perception thing, I'm not seeing it. Other people overseas aren't seeing it either. So I think the U.S. needs to be very cautious about how we go about it and making sure that the messaging is still there. The optics are still clear enough so that the people in those countries still see the U.S. as a viable world leader and not somebody that everybody's going to end up hating.
Well, there's Erdogan attended the SCO, the most recent meeting, and I think some of the things he spoke about really kind of gives us an understanding of which way he might be hedging his bets. So there's a video. I'm going to go ahead and play it as to the what was stated at the SCO meetings.
More than 20 years ago, China and Russia formed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, together with 4 former Soviet states in Central Asia. Since then, the group has ballooned into a major political, economic, and security organization with 8 permanent members. Once an obscure group that few paid attention to, the SCO has seen its geostrategic influence grow across Eurasia. And that was on full display at their latest gathering in Uzbekistan. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan attended the summit as a special guest, where he said that Turkey looked to strengthen its ties with the regional bloc.
The SCO is, in our opinion, the current representative of our ancient relations. That's why we attach importance to further improve our relations with the organization. The dialogue partnership status we've had for the past decade has been a window that opens to Asia.
President Erdogan also held a series of sideline meetings with his Chinese, Russian, and Azerbaijani counterparts. Formed back in 2002, the SCO works to strengthen security and economic cooperation in the region. Accounting for more than 40% of the world's population and 30% of its GDP, many have said the regional bloc's influence could one day rival Western-led organizations. Turkey, which is part of NATO, is also a dialogue partner of the SCO. But could Ankara become a full-fledged member in the future?
Well, it seems like they can be, Al, and I think as we close out the show, really, it's very much likely that, based on what he said, ancient relations, right? That it's much more likely that he's pushing that way. Maybe that's what we're trying to do at the same time. Remember, on our first year anniversary for the NEC-SE, we wrote the article as to how refugees are being used as weapon systems by Turkey to hold the European Union hostage. And look, whether we liked it or not, ISIS had free access through the Turkish borders into Syria and then back again into Europe, which they became operational. Maybe this is a way of Europe just saying that we have to make sure that we know which side of the fence they are on in case this war, as the vice president has said in her comments, has become a global war, expands based on what the Russians and the Ukrainians decide to do over the next couple of months, if not through this year. So if we continue another year, maybe there's individuals who are trying to make sure that there's a clear distinction that Turkey is solidly in the camp of the SCO, so they could go ahead and finally make some of the decisions that they have not been able to make when it comes to the geographic, support of NATO members that are really trying to establish that kind of a line, dividing that line between where possibly the future broader war will take place, and Ukraine will still keep getting pummeled in this process as the war expands, unfortunately. I'll give you the last word, Al, for a closeout. Your thoughts?
Well, I think you bring up some very salient points, and there's a lot of questions about, what is Erdogan's intent, what is, our intent, and then how does that play within the NATO SCO, kind of lineup, and is it better to have him as on our side, or is it better to go ahead and put him in the other column? So these are very good questions, but in the middle of those questions, we need to kind of, pay attention to the U.S. and the optics that we've got, so that we don't alienate, entire populations or continue to alienate entire populations. As we go about real politics, because information warfare is absolutely important nowadays, even probably more so than it was, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And so I think we need to be very cautious about, how we approach these problems. And if we do need to move it in the other column, do it, I think, in the right way, or at least with the minimum amount of damage. Turkey is still very important geographically. So, if there's a plan to move it in the other column, is there a plan to get it back in the right column at some point? What's the grand operational plan over time? Don't just say, well, they need to be over there, and then kind of, okay, well, the game's called now, we're done, and they're sitting on your end zone, right? So we need to be very cautious about, so we push it in the column, but then we don't follow through with whatever plan it was to finally move it back into our column on our terms, and then you've got this corridor from Russia through Turkey into the Middle East, right? So there's that corridor, and then it opens up Russia's, there's the bottleneck is now gone for everything moving out of the Black Sea. The Black Sea fleet now moves, right there in the Mediterranean, and everything's opened up. And so we need to be cautious about, if that is our plan, I would hope that the folks that are looking at it on the long-term plans, kind of the war plan orange for today, whatever color they're assigning for the SCO, that they're thinking about, what are the next steps. And are we setting ourselves up for success, or are we just kicking the can down the road and we're going to end up with a failure? But definitely it needs to be looked at, and good for you for looking at the SCO, years before. Now people are kind of recognizing it. When the battle line starts, now people recognize, hey, wait a minute, China's supporting Russia, China's supporting, Iran. How's that possible? And 20 years ago, it's like, well, yeah, they've been doing this, so, but nobody listened then. And now suddenly people are waking up to the SCO and what is it all about? And it actually means something. It wasn't just like, a fun club that these people went to. They actually were setting frameworks and agreements for operations just such as this. And so, kudos to the NEC-SE and yourself for, being one of the first out the gate to say, look, let's look at the SCO. And you said that a number of times. It kept ringing the bell in the corner. And I think it's, finally that your due has come, because people are now waking up and paying attention, as that last clip just saw it. So again, the U.S., needs to kind of have a clear strategic vision, and keep in mind, a lot of these historical events that have happened, and what are the cultural nuances between these things. Because one of the things we haven't talked about, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll be very quick. what's the interplay between Turkey and Iran? So, Iran's part of the SCO. How are the goals, as you had a guest earlier talk about, hey, what are the goals of Iran? What are the goals of Turkey? And can they sync? Can they link and sync correctly in that SCO organization? Because everybody, works to their own ends. So Iran has its power projection and where it sees its sphere of influence. Turkey has its sphere of influence and where it sees its direction, forward facing. And those two overlap in a lot of places. And can they get along, and will they get along, is the big question. And can China hold that alliance together? And that's another question. So even if they go to the other column, they may not be happy there. It may be, maybe a little dysfunctional family that Xi builds for himself over the next few years. So these are questions that need to be answered and definitely need to be looked at.
Well, they're always competing. As we wrote the article, Speaks for Islam years ago, and Turkey wants to be the leader of Islam. Iran, of course, leader of Islam. Shiite-wise, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but it seems like all of them are starting to slowly somewhat be reliant on the SCO, specifically working within those regions. I do know we have another video that may touch upon some of these important aspects that we talked about, so we'll run that, come back, and then I'll close it out.
Hello. The conflict in Ukraine has dominated talks in Uzbekistan between the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Russian counterpart. Vladimir Putin used the occasion to once again thank Turkey for its ongoing mediation efforts over Ukraine. The Russian leader also asked President Erdogan for Turkey's help in the transfer of Russian grain through Turkish ports. Their meeting is part of a regional summit called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which also gave 8 leaders the opportunity for bilateral meetings.
With the needs, we live in an era where the problems also become common. Climate change, pandemics, energy and food security, supply safety, terrorism, xenophobia, racism, illegal migration, irregular migration, and interruptions in supply chain are many of the matters of the tests we endure. And global cooperation that can be built and an understanding of understanding can only help us overcome these problems. In such eras, when we need to be united, unfortunately, some countries chose to rise walls and go more introverted. The higher the walls rise, the conscience of some become blind, and the oppressed are not heard.
Yeah, I don't know. Some of the stuff there I would have probably fired the interpreter, but it was close enough to covering some of the big points there. I think he skipped over a couple of the major points that was being made by Erdogan. But look, I think again it's going to be a hard piece thing to keep together. But under really governments that are more dictatorships than anything else, is a possibility for the SCO to be able to expand in the region. Al, I want our folks to know that I know you're really being squeezed because you get operations tonight you got to do. But for our audiences out there, if they go to the QR code, they could directly go to your bio and learn more about what Al does really for the NEC-SE. And again, I would like to remind our audience out there, especially with what happened with the earthquake, United has an appeal. We're trying to raise money to make sure that we support the efforts of other organizations around the ground. I just talked to Juliana Tamrazi, who I interviewed last week today from the Iraqi Relief Council, and I know Christian Relief Council, and I know that they're really being squeezed there to try to support as many people as possible. And thank God she was at the airport just taking off, wheels up, before this last earthquake hit this morning. She's in Jordan now. So if you can help us, we can help our folks downrange. Al, that's pretty much it from my end. Thank you to Sim Production for the type of work Fred does. Just a few last words from you, and we'll go ahead and sign off.
Actually, I covered it. I'm glad you hit this topic tonight. Very timely and very good. And then if you could just send somebody to get me out of the broom closet, I'll be happy.
I told him to close the door until the interview was over. So we got Mike on the way to open it up from the other side. Okay, God bless Al, and look forward to seeing you again. This is New Paradigms, and we'll see you at that end.
لك لا يا عم وش تقدم.
A video that captured the harrowing cruelty of last week's earthquake. A sister, Jinan, and her younger brother, Abdullah, landing as if by miracle within the thinnest space, between compounded concrete below and a crushing weight above. The video, filmed in Haram in northwest Syria by a first responder who promises that he'll rescue them. A local film crew working for Newsnight returned today to Haram village to meet the first responder who filmed the video that was seen around the world and who stayed until the children were pulled out.
صرت صيح أنا مين هون فسمعت صوت من تحت ضعيف يعني صوت طفل صغيرة عم تصيح شو بدك قامت قالت لي طالعني وبشتغل خدامة عندك فهي الجملة يعني حزت بنفسي كثير وما بعرف يعني في شيء غريب صابني جوا اني تعلقت فيها نسيت اولادي نسيت كل شيء فوصلنا للساعة 8:30 المغربيات تقريبا وبآلات بسيطة معول وكريك وكريكو يعني بأدوات بسيطة صرنا نحفر بإيدينا لبس فكان أنا سبحان الله تصويري لهالمقطع ما هو ماني صحفي ولا شيء فكانت حالة إنسانية إني هالبنت ما رح أقدر طالعها فأنا حاولت إني طالعهم هدية يعني كان صعب سحبها فطولت معنا تقريبا الساعة 2 بالليل وميتة أمهم عليهم وأبوهم كمان بنفس الوقت كمان ميت عليهم فكانت جنان وعبد الله هن الاثنين اللي طلعوا من هالعيلة كاملة.
Walking through the ruins of his family's village, Abu Muhammad al-Junaid is the uncle of the young children, Jinan and Abdullah.
عمي توفى وابنه وولاده وهون بيت أخوي هونيك بيت عمي. هلا العدد أنا يعني ما بحسن بحصيه كلياته بس يعني نحن كعائلة يعني مننا راح 20 شخص بس عالم كانت البنايات كلها مليانة ملعبوا وانت طالع للأخير كله مليان ما في ولا بيت فاضي.
In the 9 days since the earthquake struck, 84 trucks of aid have so far reached these parts of northwest Syria, according to the local authority. But it took 4 days before the first small convoy of trucks made the crossing from Turkey, sparking indignation from the Syrians here who feel abandoned and outrage from many around the world.
الحمد لله طلعنا أولاد أخوي 2 صبي وبنت ما فيهم شيء الحمد لله رب العالمين طلعوا وأمورهم كويسة والحمد لله رب العالمين إنه طلعوا هالطفلين معنا. هلا الناس عم نشوفها كشغل دفاع المدني كالعالم هون الشعب الخلق كله عام يعني صار يشتغل كويس يعني ومنيح واموره كويسه. المجتمع الدولي اللي برا ما شفته انا ما بعرف يعني ايش وضعهم ايش صار معهم ما بعرف. آلات ثقيله بالاول ما اجى بالدول ما بعتت يعني ونحن ما بدنا لا اكل ولا شرب ولا بعازة شيء ولا بأذى بدن نحن كان بس بدنا آلات فورا تجي وتنقذ هالعالم اللي صارت تحت الانقاض. هذا اللي صار معنا.
First responder Lieutenant Rahal takes us to the local hospital. There we meet our 2 survivors, Jinan and Abdullah, once again in the sheltering embrace of his sister's arms. Too young perhaps to understand what's happened, but old enough to be traumatized, ridden by shock. For now, at least, they are a small light, a candle through the fog of cement dust and twisted metal, and precious life to be cherished by those around them.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read The Difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.